come to believe that all of God's requirements for human beings are actually boiled down to just one requirement. The Bible says that Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him for righteousness. So faith is what God requires of us. And on August 28, 1934, and the reason I know that date is because it was one day after Dad's 21st birthday, he believed God. And I believe with all my heart that it was accredited to him for righteousness. So just under 75 years he served the Lord. And that's why I call him the seasoned warrior. The seasoned warrior stood his ground and faced the enemy down. With his commander side by side, they held the higher ground. The enemy roared, he ranted and raved, and tried to destroy the man. But the seasoned warrior stood his ground with a gleaming sword in his hand. His gleaming sword in his hand. His helmet was scarred from the blows it had seen. It had saved his life many times. His breastplate, though old, was firmly in place. It hadn't been off for a while. And strapped to his waist was an old leather belt. He called it his belt of truth. He'd worn it for years. It had served him well from the days when he was a youth. He served as a warrior, though he shed many tears. He battled the enemy so many years. He was ready for furlough. It was time to go home, but he still held his sword in his hand. On his feet, all dusty and worn, sandals of peace he wore. Many a mile, through many a trial, they'd walked together before. In the early days, when his shield was small, he was wounded with many a blow. But his commander taught him well, and his faith continued to grow. He served as a warrior, though he shed many tears. He battled the enemy so many years. He was ready for furlough. It was time to go home, but he still held his sword in his hand. Soon, when he could muster out and go home. But the battle raged on, and his spirit was strong, and he could still hold his own. But he had one request of his comrades in arms to be granted when he made his last stand. He asked to be buried with his full armor on, with his sword in his hand. He wanted his sword in his hand. Well, he served as a warrior, though he shed many tears. He battled the enemy so many years. He was ready for furlough. It was time to go home, but he still held his sword in his